Hi, I'm Pastor Jim. This is In Depth, a video series we do here at Clifton Lutheran Church that attempts to take a topic and go deeper. Today's topic is timely: violence. At the time of the recording of this video, there's been yet another school shooting in America. And while these school shootings and mass shootings oftentimes have vast differences between them, one of the things that is common to see is what happened here, the leaving behind of a manifesto. We haven't seen what's in the manifesto, but we can assume that it will likely have an ideological defense for the violence caused and potentially calls for further violence. It will probably be incoherent and maybe involve mental illness. And because it will seem to be so stark in difference from my lived experience, which is largely peaceable, it'd be easy to dismiss and say that it is the ramblings of a lunatic that doesn't need to be paid attention to. This may be correct, but is to learn the wrong lesson. The lesson is to say that actually calls for violence are quite normative. They're all around us. And while they might be loud and obnoxious and lunatic, they can also be presented as quite rational, necessary, quiet, sometimes understated, but nevertheless, the ideological defense that violence is called for, and to be ready for violence, and to be accustomed to violence. That is something that unfortunately is all around us. It is not good enough for us to miss that point as Christians. We have to ask ourselves today, and we will ask ourselves in this video, a couple questions. One is Christianity one of those ideological voices calling for violence? Has it been historically? If Christianity offers up an alternative, then in what way? And how can it bolster its case for a nonviolent future in opposition to, and we will try to make, the strongly held belief that violence is unfortunately central to the human condition and must be? So let's begin. And probably a good place to start is with definitions. Violence, as it's talked about now, has a more expansive definition than even several years ago. We now talk about violence in terms of not only physical violence, but also sexual violence, economic violence even. The common thread that weaves them together is twofold. One is that it is coercive. It is against the will, it is against the wishes of the person who is receiving it or the group that is receiving it. But that's not enough, because that would mean that every parent is guilty of violence when they are acting coercively to get your kid to eat vegetables and to go to bed. That would mean that the educational system, even in theory, is a theoretically violent one, where it takes kids who might not want to go to school that day. But the point of the schooling, the point of parenting, actually is directed towards well-being, towards human flourishing. This is the second point, that in our discussion today, and for any good definition of violence, well-being and flourishing need to be the goal of the nonviolent response and the opponent of a violent response. That violence seeks to do something that is for the bad, for the ill of a person against their wishes. This is going to be our operational definition. So, ideologies that will say that violence is necessary have a couple of defenses, and they're pretty strong. The first is to say, if you look at human condition over history, it's always been that human beings are in a dialogue with violence. So for instance, if we were to look at the historical record and see what would the average anthropologically human have encountered in their life, it would have been quite a lot of violence. They would have seen it in the natural world all around them. They would have encountered it in their own search for food. They would have needed to be a good practitioner of violence in order to secure their resources and their access to resources. We can say then, if peace is even a goal, if peace and the well-being of a person is a goal, the more they are accustomed and able to perpetrate violence might be an indication of how little violence them, their people around them, and their relationships experience. We can judge a system, indeed, by how much peace it's able to produce through violence. You get surprising answers, by the way, when you do this. So you might think to yourself that when we develop fences, when we develop agriculture, when we develop protective systems such as kingship that are hierarchical and produce the professional warrior class, that we would have less violence found in the archaeological record of those humans. But indeed, it is the exact opposite. All of those things seem to point that society more towards a path of violence. Interesting. In the biblical story, as it has a historical bent, we see that some of the earliest writings on violence that are in the Hebrew Bible are about the curtailment of it, not the elimination. War is a feature of the Hebrew Bible. It is something that the people of Israel are well acquainted with. It's a feature that the patriarchs even know about. They know about how to be practitioners of violence, and they will even say that this is something godly, that God and God's self will fight with us as we have this battle. There are moments in the Hebrew Bible in which the proximity of God to violence is very uncomfortable, and in which the people of Israel do acts that would be considered war crimes, would be considered the kind of violence that is never acceptable. There are also moments that are probably more profound, and more profound in the way that I say that they're a profound departure from the other ethical systems that surround Israel, that call for limitations, even in the most egregious cases such as war, where violence is going to be a part of your life. They call for limitations, and they say, here's who a proper combatant is, and they say when and where it is inappropriate to prosecute this war any further. This is the beginnings of a theory that Christianity will also develop on, in the case of conflict, what is the way to protect the maximum amount of peace when we will undoubtedly experience violence. Then Christianity comes onto the scene, and we'll return to the New Testament in just a little bit as we get into the theological side of this. But as the history goes, Christianity does seem to be initially something that purported to nonviolence. However, in the historical record, we also find Christians living lives of violence that they believe to be completely compatible with their Christian faith. Service in the military was something that Christians did. Sometimes compulsory service in the military. One of the famous stories about Constantine is that he saw a cross in the heavens, a Chi-Rho, that told him, put this symbol on the shields of your soldiers and they will win victory. This is a part of the story of his conversion, the Emperor Constantine. Now, historians have pointed out that Constantine was accustomed to seeing the Chi-Rho on the shields of some of his soldiers. A lot of conscripts were Christians themselves. And indeed, those conscripts were oftentimes given some of the most violent parts of the war, where they might kill or be killed. And as such, Christians actually had a reputation for being very effective soldiers, as opposed to what you might think in terms of Christians leading lives where they were always the victims of Roman violence. Many of them were personal and professional soldiers waging war against the empire's enemies. So as we move into the Middle Ages, where the church is the dominant force, dominant theological force, you might expect that we will see then that theology at play. Whatever theology the church has about violence should be manifest in the society that it has such control over. And what we see is widespread violence. This is a stunning condemnation of the church. If the church is going to call itself a nonviolent agent in the world, then the point in time in which we had the greatest dominion also coincided with the most internal and external violence in the world. Not only the Crusades, but also interior fighting was just rampant in Europe at the time. So, the Lutheran Reformation is a time in which Lutherans might look to say, well, then where do we specifically within this story stand? And Luther's own writings on the Bauernhofkrieg, this is a place where we can see, we call it the Peasants' War in English. They were a group who had been influenced, ironically, by Luther's own writings to take what they heard him saying they deserved, which was human flourishing. That they were supposed to live in a society far more egalitarian according to the intent of Christ, as they now could read and have access to. And so they revolt. And Luther calls for a very, very severe putting down of this revolt using all means necessary and lots of violence. I don't know why, but he seems to have experienced violence in his lifetime that made him think that the lawlessness that would come with this violence would be even greater than the violence that he called for in putting it down. And I think that is illustrative in terms of why the church was so tolerant around these acts of widespread violence and violence all around. So it saw the world, and Lutherans see the world too, as being divided into two sort of modalities, and one of which is absolutely rooted in this world as it is right now, and in honesty about the fact that there will be violence as a part of our lives. This is an acknowledgement of the historical story that I just told you. There is going to be a necessity for us to have authority, for us to have a dialogue with minimal but still necessary violence to keep order and to keep peace from being able to happen. So this is the same doctrine that, for instance, will go on to inform a lot of our civil discussion about violence, that we might have necessity to arm our police officers and to give them a badge, but also we're going to hold them to a very high standard of conduct then, if they're going to be our professional internal violence class. And the same deal goes for our external, that anytime we deploy the armed forces, it must be for just reasons, first of all, and we expect just conduct out of them, because to say that this violence is necessary is a high bar. It should involve us being very clear about that. The doctrine of these two modalities will then say that there is, and we acknowledge there to be, a different modality, one that involves God's wishes. And God's wishes are for peace. And God's promised future is for a peaceable one. It's the dialogue between these two things that is actually very fruitful, because to acknowledge that human beings live violent lives, that we live sinful lives, sinfully violent, violence that is not called for, and as part of our systems there's a condemnation unto those systems, that they do these things, and it is wrong that they do so. That is to say that when God's kingdom comes about, that will be on account solely of God's work. Because what we have contributed to the world is antithetical to this peaceable kingdom that is promised in Isaiah, that is promised in the Gospels, that is Jesus' promise to us. That is something that God's work has done, and we, through our violence, have undone. I am a believer in that future and of how we get there. Let's have a little look, first of all, at our Bibles and see what it is that we learn in the New Testament that might be instructive as to how Christians can live lives amid violent systems, and what we can do and how we can be participants. So the first story, I'm only going to talk about 3 stories within Scripture, because with the New Testament, because this is a long history and we could go on and on if we were to do it that way. But the first one that I want to pick up on is a thread that goes back to the Hebrew Bible. And do you remember the story of when Jesus takes a whip of cords, it says in Scripture, and drives the moneylenders out of the court, striking their tables, but also them with this whip in an act of violence? Let's be clear about it. This is Jesus conducting this event. And then he speaks the words where he says, "You have turned my Father's house into a marketplace. Well, this is an event where Jesus himself is behaving violently. He is being coercive, and wait a minute, is he behaving against the best interests of these people? Well, perhaps not. It is definitely an act that involves striking somebody. It's physical violence for sure. And I think we can't excuse that in the story. We can say that this is part of this older story about how sometimes physical violence, sometimes war even at its largest scale is inevitable. This happens to us, and to be clear-headed about that and honest. But it is for a goal, and the goal is what Jesus plans on bringing about, which is a peaceable kingdom, a heavenly kingdom. And economic violence taking place within the sanctuary is inappropriate in that context. Second story. This is the one I'm sure you're thinking of, and you're sure that I was going to get to. Turn the other cheek. It continues, however, with other parts of that. Turn the other cheek. Share the cloak. Give your second outer garment as well. Walk the extra mile. So these stories, or these aphorisms, seem to indicate that there is a way to counter violence, counter this coercion with agency, that there's something you can actually do. And it's not to respond with violence in kind, but it is to offer up something different. This is something that will famously, of course, be picked up by Martin Luther King Jr. as he studies Gandhi too, and they develop a theory of nonviolent resistance. It is still resistance. It is still something that you can do against the oppressor. And keep in mind that the biblical context for this passage is Roman occupation. The people who are being given this advice are being shown a way actually to affect their own oppressors and afflict their own oppressors with compassion. The things that would happen to an oppressed person would commonly be things like pilfering and being asked for their goods without any compensation, or asked for their service, such as walking a mile. It's not just walking a mile, it's oftentimes walking a mile in a forced march with the pack or with the materials that army has requested from you. So this is theft. And how do we oppose our oppressors, especially when you're a beaten people, when your army is no longer and there is no legitimate way to do it? Jesus offers us up here a way that has been instructive in the world about that we would call nonviolent resistance. And we can do an assessment, by the way, also of how effective is nonviolent resistance. Historically speaking and statistically speaking, those nations that have wanted to overthrow a dictator, for instance, are most likely to succeed when they utilize nonviolent resistance, more effective than when it results in violence. So if we're going to have this discussion, I think this is very useful for us to be coherent at and adroit at speaking to, because when any of us are Christians, in all likelihood, we are a hyphenated Christian. We're Christian along with several other ideologies that we're also being a part of. And it can be instructive because those other ideologies may or may not also be calling for violence. And let me just give you an example. So, as a Christian leftist, if you hold leftist ideas about the improving of society and the hopeful instituting of a more just, more liberated society, you will, at some point in time, probably come across somebody who says that violence is necessary to get us from here to there. This might be a conflict with your Christian faith. And you can now effectively say, no, this is actually counterproductive. The more that we behave violently, the more that it will be indistinguishable to see us as different from our opponents, whether they be imperialists or fascists or some other non-leftist ideology. Look at the historical record of this, for instance. The Bolsheviks were definitely a group that found that violence was necessary to their cause. The Bolshevik violence then turned into the largest leftist revolution of its time until Mao. And in both of those scenarios, in both the Bolshevik revolution that gets us to Stalin, which Stalin is a perpetrator of internal violence to the Soviet Union at a scale never before seen, and in Mao's case too, this conflict and the repression and the violence that's inherent in those historical events is cited as one of the reasons why many leftist ideas should not even be proposed, should not even be considered legal to be proposed in various democratic and parliamentarian and congressional systems. That is to say that violence has had such a deleterious effect on the stated goals of leftism that it proves the point that violence itself can be utterly counterproductive. And you can take this out of the dialogue that I just gave, the example that I just gave, and apply it to any other ideology that you're hyphenated your Christian with. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, violence, if it's a right-hand kingdom, if this is a necessity out of this world violence, needs to be seen as being counterproductive to God's goal, which is of this peaceable kingdom. Yes, there may be the causes where we will be told that we must be a part of practicing violence today. Yes, there are definitely moments where that's going to be a part of our lived experience. But let's get to our third biblical thing to show us where is Jesus in all this. And the statement that I want to talk about is the crucifixion. The most profound piece of violence that the Bible details is the agonizing death at the hands of the state by Jesus Christ. It goes into all the gory detail about what happened to him. It's an astonishingly long segment of each of the four Gospels that goes into how Jesus exactly was killed. Why does it do that? Why are we supposed to unflinchingly look at just how hurt Jesus was? I propose that one of the reasons why is that the Bible is so clear-headed about violence, about the violence that the recipients would have heard and will hear and will be a part of, so that they know that in their moment where they are a part of a world that is doing an incredible cruelty unto them, against, again, those two definitions, against their wishes and against their well-being, that they would see that God is with them. That where the power resides is not with the cruel oppressor, not with the practitioner of this violence, but indeed it lies with the person who is in the deepest solidarity with them in that moment, the crucified one, Jesus Christ. So this is the location of where we fundamentally see God in dialogue with violence, in victimhood, but not there forever. Because if that's all we had was a God who told us that he promises to suffer with us, that would be fine and nice. We have a God who promises to overcome the violence through God's means, resurrection means. This opens up a couple pathways for us. One is this aforementioned passive resistance, nonviolent resistance. Another is for us to locate our courage in this moment. If we are promised the resurrection, if we are told that God will empower us even up to and over the greatest thing that violence can do, which is death, the fear of death and the torture and the pain that goes along with it, that if God can be with us there, then we can pursue projects that would otherwise leave us vulnerable. We can pursue projects that could be undone through violence. And that's a pathway that historically has been actually very evidenced and very powerful and can be attested to. And lastly, the thing that we get out of the resurrection is we get the promise, the eschatological promise, that ultimately God's promised future does not come about through enough killing. And this is the point that I think is the most important for me in the world today. As these ideologies are so, whether they're quiet or loud, are insisting that violence is the only way, they're ignoring the fact that it is, in fact, a self-defeating way. That the eschatological proof that Jesus has offered has been proven. There is but one way we get to efficacious peace, and that is through good. That is through us doing good to one another, doing things like investing in one another, through being an intentional community with one another, through acts of forgiveness, and through acts of solidarity and passive nonviolent resistance. All of these things have a proven track record that has changed the world for the positive. The thing that seems to do the worst to the world is violence. Violence actually has quite an awful track record of promoting peace, in spite of people saying that it will. And listen, there are people who are going to fundamentally disagree with that last segment, and they're going to disagree on, like I said, fundamental terms. They're going to say that good is just defined differently entirely. Violence itself can be a good thing. So when you come across people for whom violence is just its own good, don't even bother with this conversation. In all honesty, they have a different, deepest held value than you do. Honestly, if you recognize it and they're honest about it, that's the best that can come out of it, is that at least they told you who they were and what they believed in from the very start. The most dangerous things is that these ideologies and those deep values oftentimes become hidden. And you think you're talking to a person who believes in peace and believes that peace is actually a good thing and that human flourishing is a good thing and that all people are entitled to it, when in fact they're hiding a deeper belief where they don't. They don't believe that. But they know that you're going to end this conversation and that there is no further means of conversation if they don't pretend at least to agree with that value. Values are only as good as the practice we put them in. And I think if we were to judge ourselves and our society by the valuing of peace and the valuing of trying to exonerate and trying to exercise violence from our systems and from our world, then our systems right now would be under indictment. They would say, we have not produced the peace that you've promised, and you are in need of reform. And that's a call to action for all of us. I think that part of how this happens is through conversation, and get to reiterate my last point, conversation with the right people, conversation with people who are reachable and who do believe, as you just said, that having a life that is a peaceable life is a better life. And that is true across culture and across people. Therefore, how are we building towards that? So begin with conversation. The second thing then is for us to take our Christian faith and to be motivated by it. And say, it's also intolerable for us not to speak out and not to give witness to a world that is in violence far too often. It is for us then to also be creative. We can look at many of the systems that we already talked about and all the different ways that we are together in community and say, what is a way in which we can minimize violence as it becomes here? That we've sort of tangentially talked about economic violence. The thing about having prosperous communities is they tend to be peaceable in every other way too. So how do we build communities that don't experience deep poverty? We will undo a tremendous amount of violence just by doing that. As we work together, let us remember that this is something that God is at work doing. This is not something we do alone. This is not something that we do even out of our deepest human nature, because our deepest human nature might be the flawed nature that causes violence to happen. But if we remember and take heart in the fact that Christ, the Paschal victim, has become Christus Victor, the victorious one who, through no violence, has already achieved the kingdom that is becoming evidenced every day all around us, that is something that we can take heart and have faith and hope in. Thank you for coming with us on today's journey. I hope that this is something that has left you a little bit better educated with, perhaps something that has asked you some questions, and maybe you want to have further dialogue with me, which I always invite, and I hope also inspired. Too often when violence occurs in our communities, we feel helpless. And my goal in today's talk is to move us to a place where we actually recognize that God's power is at work in the world already, having victory over this. Thank you.